In the last two class days of lecture, you guys learned about classics, music, literature, art, and now today on history with Mr. E, we're going to go over 22.1 and 22.2 and talk about the rise of modernism. A lot of problems happened because of modernism. There was a lot of liberality in religion, and a lot of this religious liberalism denied the basic doctrines of Christianity. It was humanistic thought creeping back into European society. Europe was spiritually dead after the 40 Years' War, after being messed over for so many years by the Catholic Church and by the Protestant Church just turning into a mess. Europe was spiritually dead. The French Revolution inspired, instead of religion, they inspired something called revolutionary nationalism. After years and years of the Holy Roman Empire and years of Napoleon's empire in Europe and fighting back against all those terrible things, controlling them, a lot of these smaller countries wanted their own identity and wanted their own natural borders. And that became revolutionary nationalism. And they knew that the way to get their own borders, to get their own country, was to fight for it, to throw a revolution. Revolutions in France lasted from, 1789 to 1848 or something like that. There were major revolutions in 1830 and 1848 in France, and Europe just followed suit after that. At the time of the 1830s, Italy was actually ruled for some reason by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But they decided to leave Austrian rule, and Italy unified all of its smaller states into one nation. By 1861, they had their first parliament, and Victor Emmanuel II of Sardinia became the first king of Italy. Emmanuel. Victor Emmanuel II of Sardinia became the first king of Italy. France had occupied the city of Rome. Within the city of Rome was the Vatican and Vatican City. And they withdrew, under a unified Italy, withdrew from Rome in 1870. Italy took over Rome. Rome is now the capital of Italy. The Pope at the time was Pope Pius, Pius, the Ninth. That's IX in Roman numerals. Pope Pius the Ninth. And he ended up retreating to the Vatican, and for the first time in over 1,000 years, the Pope had no authority in Europe outside of the Church. He didn't rule any lands. He wasn't anybody's big boss. He wasn't pulling the strings of politics. He just was over the Church. And that's pretty much the way it is now. They still have a lot of influence over people's thoughts, hearts, and minds, but the Church doesn't have political influence anymore. Rome was made the capital of Italy in 1871, and Germany then followed suit with Italy. 1850, Germany was still states, a collection of states, smaller states influenced by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The most dominant state in Germany was Prussia. The Chancellor of Prussia was a man named Otto, O-T-T-O, von, V-O-N, Bismarck, B-I-S-M-A-R-C-K. He decided that he was going to take Germany and build an empire. And he united Germany, all those states, by conquering them and united them through war. The first king, which the Germans called Kaiser, K-I-S-E-R, Kaiser of United Germany, was King Wilhelm I, W-I-L-H-E LM, King Wilhelm I. And Kaiser is a derivation of the word from the Roman Empire. What is it, Chapito? Kaiser? That's right, Caesar. Bismarck wanted peace in Europe. Otto von Bismarck did, so Germany could develop into a more powerful nation. Remember, at this time, what's going on? The early Industrial Revolution, and Germany needed to catch up. Bismarck made powerful alliances and did work their hardest to keep France, which had suffered under Napoleon's rule, diplomatically isolated from the rest of Europe. They didn't want France to get any power. Germany and France have been rivals and enemies for many, many years. This was called the era of Otto von Bismarck, or the era of Bismarck. But in 1890, King Wilhelm II took over. He fired Bismarck as chancellor. Chancellor is basically like the president. And built a massive naval fleet that could rival the British fleet, which was the strongest navy in the world. By 1914, he'd built this fleet, and he decided that he wanted to expand the German Empire and formed something called the Triple Alliance. Now, remember this. The Triple Alliance was 3 different countries: Italy, Germany, and Austria-Hungary, Austria-Hungary. That was the empire in Europe that still existed in Central and some parts Eastern Europe. That's the Triple Alliance that eventually became, in World War I, the Central Powers. As this was happening, this massive alliance, they knew that Europe was about to go to war, so the other nations in Europe, England, France, and Russia, formed something called the Triple Entente, Entente, the Triple Entente, which became the Allied powers, England, France, and Russia. And Europe began to get pretty tense. They were just waiting for a reason, Germany was, to go to war in Europe and conquer all of Europe. And then the reason came about. An anarchist from Serbia shot and killed the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire by the name of Archduke Francis, Francis, Ferdinand, Ferdinand, Francis Ferdinand, and his wife, when they were driving through the city of Sarajevo, Sarajevo, this Serbian anarchist assassinated them. After a month of negotiations and discussions and talks, Austria and Germany got fed up and declared war on Serbia on July 28, 1914. That's the start of what we call World War I. All of a sudden, since war was declared and there were so many alliances going around, Europe took sides, and we had our first World War. The war grew all the way around the globe. By this time, the Navy in Great Britain was built up strong. The German Navy was strong. Italy withdrew from the Triple Alliance because Germany was aggressors. They were the ones being aggressive in this war, so Italy dropped out of the Triple Alliance and joined the Allies, or the Triple Entente. Although they started the war neutral, they joined up later. And now we're on 22.2, World War I. War in Europe is a terrible thing. What was the last war in Europe that happened? Does anybody remember? That is correct, Mr. Labria. The last major war in Europe were the Napoleonic Wars, where they had the Battle of Nations and the Battle of Waterloo. And Napoleon led his troops against all of Europe, conquered most of Europe, floundered in Russia, and finally was stopped after escaping the island of Elba at Waterloo before he was put on St. Helena, where he passed away. This war was bigger than that by a large amount. After 3 months, the German army had conquered Belgium, that's the Netherlands, or Denmark, and overrun, no, that's not the Netherlands. Belgium's its own country. I apologize for saying that. But they had conquered Belgium and overrun much of France. Remember, the Germans don't seem to like France very much. By September 1914, they were within 15 miles of the city of Paris. If Paris fell, France would fall. But the French stopped the German attack and pushed them back across the Marne River, M-A-R-N-E. This is the Battle of the Marne, M-A-R-N-E. That's the first major offensive of the war. Then there was the race to the sea, where the Germans and the Allies raced to control parts of the North Sea. That's the sea that's north of Europe. They met in a massive battle in Ypres, Belgium. Ypres, Y-P-R-E-S, Ypres. I think that's how you pronounce it. It's not Ypres or Yippers, but Ypres, Belgium. In this battle, the British armies lost 50,000 men. And the Germans and the Allies dug in trenches with a few miles between them and used those trenches for cover. And now the trenches stretched from the English Channel, which is in the northern part of France, which is the smallest gap between France, or the main continent of Europe, and the island of Great Britain. And these trenches stretched for 600 miles south and east, all the way from the English Channel to the Swiss Alps. And this was by Christmas in the first year of the war, 1914. 600 miles of trenches. Now, there were new weapons in this war because it was a modern age and technology was catching up with warfare. But these weren't good weapons. These weren't stun guns. These were deadly weapons. The Germans created mustard gas. It was typically a mixture of chlorine, which is bleach, and ammonia, which is also used as cleaning fluid. Never mix those two things. They will destroy your lungs. Kill everyone in your house. If you're looking to scrub the floors at your house, do not mix bleach and ammonia. It will kill you. It will make mustard gas. And that's what they threw into the trenches on the other side of the battle. Giant clouds of mustard gas would fall on the trenches, and many people had their lungs destroyed. My great-grandfather being one of them. My great-grandpa was a Slovak, and he joined the French Foreign Legion because that part of the world hadn't been involved in the war yet, but he knew that he needed to fight, so he joined the French Foreign Legion and fought for them, but was gassed during the war, and it eventually led to his death. When he immigrated to America after World War I with his family, the only work he could find was in a coal mine, and he already had damaged lungs. And eventually he was suffering so much from working in the coal mine that they let him drive trucks at the top of the coal mine, and he eventually died from pneumonia because his lungs were so damaged. The Germans also invented, and don't get me wrong, the Germans invented poison gas, but the Brits and the French and the other side also used their own version of poison gas on the Germans. The Germans also invented the flamethrower, which was two tanks that mixed together petroleum and another chemical, and shot it that you wore on your back, and it would shoot it down a tube and out a pipe that was lit on fire at the end, and it would shoot a flame 30, 40 feet, and that would burn everything in its path. The problem with the flamethrower is if somebody shot you in the back while you were wearing a flamethrower, you went and exploded like a giant bomb. They're also very heavy and bulky, and they ran out of fuel after a few minutes. But they were brutal, horrible weapons. The Allies, during World War I, were the first to invent the tank. And the original tanks were basically trucks with the sides of them had plate metal on them, and they were used as troop transports. And eventually the tanks replaced the cavalry. Cavalry were horses that people would ride into battle on, make charges on horses. They eventually replaced horses and made a motorized cavalry, which was tanks. Eventually tanks became giant rolling guns. They could traverse bad trench, and terrible ground that had been beaten up and bombed by battle. It was basically a rolling cannon. Neither side could break through their line of trenches, though. Sometimes the Allies would push a few miles into the line. Sometimes the Germans would push back a few miles. In 1916, 2 years into the war, the Germans mounted a major offensive through the French lines with a massive assault on the city, the fortress city, that's a fortified city, French city of Verdun, Verdun. The Germans threw artillery, which is bombs, major cannons, bombs, for 24 hours into the city of Verdun, thinking that they were going to soften the defenses of the city. But the French put up huge opposition. After 6 months of this offensive, the Germans had only pushed through 4 miles of the French lines. This came at a cost of 540,000 French soldiers. Now that's casualties. That means dead or wounded. And casualties on the German side was 430,000. 540,000 French, 430,000 Germans. That is 970,000 people grand total. That's nearly 1 million people died in the Verdun offensive. The British launched their own offensive at the Somme River, Somme, Somme River in France. In the 6 days, the British artillery, long-range weapons, attacked in a massive barrage, followed by a humongous British charge at the German lines from the British infantry. Infantry means foot soldiers. Cavalry means mounted or motorized soldiers. Artillery means long distance, in case you didn't know. And the Brits only gained 7 miles in this massive attack. 7 miles into the German lines. And they lost 600,000 casualties. 600,000 casualties, and the Germans suffered 500,000 casualties for 1,100,000 men injured or dead. The Germans who had started this war knew that they were about to lose the war. So they retooled and thought of new ways to fight the war. And one was to give control to a man named von Hindenburg, Von Hindenburg. Von Hindenburg was given control of the German army and basically became a dictator of Germany. He took control of the entire country. There were massive, massive naval battles. The most important naval battle of the war was in the North Sea. That's the sea north of Europe, of course. And that was the Battle of Jutland, Jutland. And this was the battle that ended the naval attacks for the Germans in the war, the Battle of Jutland. and the Germans were forced to stay in port for the rest of the war. It finally quieted their navy. Now, the thing about the German Navy, we're going to find out soon, is that they had a type of technology that Europe really didn't have yet. Now, but first we're going to talk about different fronts of the war. The Eastern Front. The Russians had a huge army, but they were very poorly equipped and very poorly trained. They lost tons of men. They were fighting in Russia, on a front in Russia, and Russian winter was brutal. They were poorly equipped. They were poorly fed, poorly taken care of. They didn't have good weapons, and they lost man after man after man after man after man. They fought against the Germans and Austrians, but by the winter of 1917, they had lost 1 million men. 1 million men. And that's when the Russian people got fed up. The Russian Revolution took place in February of 1917. The Tsar was overthrown and a new democratic government was put in place. It was modeled after Western democracies, but the Russian army fell apart. And finally, communist factions, revolutionaries under V.I. Lenin, Lenin, overthrew the government in what we call the Bolshevik Revolution. Bolshevik, Bolshevik, Bolshevik revolution, and the communist nation in Russia was formed. Lenin immediately signed a ceasefire and got Russia out of the war with Germany. The ceasefire was a treaty called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, 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 and it was signed in 1918. The Russians lost land. They lost over 1 million people, but they were glad to get out of the war and deal with their own problems at home. The war extended to Africa and Asia. The British and French had subdued all the German colonies in Africa. T.E. Lawrence led Arab revolts against the Turks on the Arabian Peninsula. They made a movie about that called Lawrence of Arabia. A British man named Allenby, British soldier named Allenby, Allenby, conquered and captured Jerusalem in December 1917, and the Brits held Jerusalem until 1948, something that they couldn't really do that well during the what do you call it, Chapito? The Crusades, thank you. And they held Jerusalem until they made Jerusalem an independent state after World War II. The Brits also did a campaign in a place called Gallipoli, Gallipoli. The strategist for this campaign, the man who planned it, was a young Winston Churchill. Churchill, Churchill. He became famous during World War II as the Prime Minister, of Great Britain. But this was World War I. And they wanted to go through the back door in Turkey and land in Gallipoli, but it was so badly botched that not only did they have to withdraw, the Allies have to withdraw, but Churchill was forced to resign his post as a military leader at the time in near disgrace. It nearly ended his career. But what ended this long, drawn out, awful, bloody, terrible war? I'll tell you what did. America. The United States started the war as neutral. And from 1914 to 1916, what they really did to support the war effort was export supplies to the Allies. Most exports that they had for the Allies were bought on credit because they were too busy spending their money on fighting the war and didn't have any money to pay for stuff. And America knew that if they were to ever get paid back, The Allies had to win the war. So financial reasons probably helped America join the war. Plus, there was much anti-German sentiment going on and growing during these first 3 years of the war, 14, 15, and 16. One of the main reasons was that little piece of technology I talked about earlier, the German submarine, also known as a U-boat or an Unterseeboot or Unterseeboot. The Germans answered a British naval blockade because the British had a massive and powerful army. They answered that blockade, and a blockade is where they put ships and stop anybody from going through, doing any shipping that they didn't want to go through and do any shipping, with U-boats, undersea boats, submarines, the earliest diesel-operated submarines. In 1915, the Germans declared the British Isles a war zone. You know, Britain is an island, and all around those islands they decided was a war zone. And they began to sink ships without warning. Could you see a submarine underwater? No. They could ram a ship. They could fire torpedoes at a ship. They could surface and fire torpedoes. And it was a total surprise attack. There was no way to really fight against these unless they built their own torpedoes or developed a weapon that could fight them, like depth charges, which were bombs that they'd chuck overboard, fall so far into the water, and then explode, causing damage to ships. But it was just, you didn't know what you were shooting at because you couldn't see underwater until they developed something called radar, which sent, or sonar, which sent sound out into the water, and when the sound came bouncing back, if it was different, they could hear it and tell that there were objects in the water around them. But this took a long time to develop and really didn't come about that well until World War II. The Germans were sinking ships without warning, and one of those ships that they sank was a British luxury liner, a cruise ship, called the Lusitania. Lusitania, the Lusitania. They sunk that ship on May 7th, 1915, somewhere off the coast of Ireland. 1,198 passengers were killed. Remember, this was a passenger ship. The Germans claimed that they knew that they were transporting war materials on that ship. The real problem, the real mistake Germany made for this was that there were 128 Americans on board that ship. The U.S. government and the people of America were mad. And I'm still a little mad about it right now, and I wasn't even around for another 63 years. This was a dirty thing to do, but they claimed that they were justified in sinking that ship because it was also transporting not just people, but war materials. The U.S. government sent Germany an ultimatum. Back off, quit attacking civilian ships, or we will go to war. Do not sink any merchant ships without warning. Don't do it. And they listened. They promised not to do it for a couple years, but then in 1917, the Germans resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. They attacked whoever they wanted, and they weren't going to stop. Remember, Germany was not doing that well in the war. They'd been beat up pretty bad. They had to find a way to gain an advantage, and they had to stop shipping from America to the Allies. Then the Germans made another big goof. They wrote a letter to Mexico from Germany promising land to be returned to Mexico that the U.S. had taken from Mexico during a war, the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, I don't remember which one. I guess it was called the Spanish-American War. We didn't really fight a Mexican-American War. The Spanish-American War, which we had crushed Mexico and taken a big chunk of the American Southwest, Mexico, parts of Arizona and parts of California and Texas, etc. They had promised to give that land back to Mexico if they were to help Germany. But that note was intercepted by an American and published in the United States newspapers. That's called the Zimmerman Note. The Zimmerman Note. Zimmerman. And that was the straw that broke it. The sinking of the Lusitania. The unrestricted submarine warfare. That's one, two things. The third thing was the Zimmerman Note. Knowing that Germany was working hard to conquer America, America decided it was time to declare war on the Central Powers on April 6th, 1917. America was ready for war. They had been mobilizing for war anyhow. And they sent over 1 million soldiers to France by July of 1918. Those soldiers were nicknamed doughboys because they were a little soft, because they hadn't fought in this terrible war for several years, and because the American Red Cross sent over hundreds of trucks filled with fryers that were constantly frying donuts for the troops, doughboys. And then we fought on the Western Front from 1917 until the end of the war, alongside the British and the French, and later Italy. The final German offensive was in 1918, and they went to capture Paris. They knew that if they took Paris and held Paris, that Europe would withdraw from the war. And they wanted to get this done before America landed 1 million troops, which they ended up doing. So obviously Germany wasn't successful. But they advanced on that Western Front with men and men and men and more men, and came within 40 miles of the city of Paris. But by 1918, American reinforcements had arrived, and the French and American troops fought under the leadership of the French Marshal Foch, Foch, and began to drive the Germans back and back and back, and the Central Powers, under that pressure from the new American troops and the French and the British, began to fall apart. First, Bulgaria left the war, and then Turkey, and then Austria fell apart. Revolution broke out in Germany, and the new German government that set up after the revolution asked for an armistice, asked for a treaty. Armstice, armistice. The armistice was signed on November 11th, 1918 at exactly 11 a.m., 11:11 at 11. That became Armistice Day, or Veterans Day in the United States, and Armistice Day in Britain and France and other parts of Europe. But World War I, now that it's over, was still a horrible, horrible, horrible war. 13 million men were dead. 21 million more men were wounded. That's 34 million people. That's, I don't know, a fifth of the entire population of the United States or something like that? Horrible, horrible, horrible. Americans had just participated, along with Europe, in the first modern war. Americans sent relief to all of Germany, and it became known, World War I became known as the war to end all wars. There was a peace conference held at Versailles. You guys remember Versailles. It used to be the French bureaucracy and pleasure palace, but it's now, still a palace in the seat of the French government. On January 18th, 1919, they held a conference at Versailles to find peace among equals. Russia was communist. I don't know if they even attended. In fact, I'm pretty sure that they didn't. And they weren't really accepted into the European community at the time. And none of the Central Powers, Austria-Hungary, Germany, and other Central Powers were even invited to this peace conference. And this peace conference was a toughie for Germany and Austria-Hungary. They spent 2 months at this peace conference with what we call the Big Four. The Big Four. The Big Four included the United States, the U.S., the British, France, and the Italians. The Big Four: U.S., Brits, French, and Italians. And that's where they formed, under the urging of they formed the League of Nations. They formed this League of Nations to maintain peace and to guarantee international cooperation among the nations of the world to achieve peace and security. The League of Nations. Then they signed the Treaty of Versailles, which, remember, Germany was not invited to be part of this, but they were forced to sign that armistice to end the war. They signed and wrote the Treaty of Versailles. And these are 3 of the things that happened to Versailles, in the Treaty of Versailles. Germany lost territory called Alsace and Lorraine, Alsace Lorraine, which I think was more part of France anyhow. The German army was demilitarized, taken apart, and Germans weren't allowed to have an army. And the Germans were forced to make not only an admission of guilt to say that they did wrong, but they're also forced to pay $33 billion in reparations to pay the debts that these other European nations had incurred in the war. Because remember, they all owed America a ton of money. And then they signed something called the Peace of Paris with the other Central Powers. All the Central Powers lost land. Everybody that had fought on the German side lost land. That's number 1. At the Peace of Paris, Austria and Hungary, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, became 2 separate nations. Austria, Germany's footstool, according to Chiara, and Hungary, which I had dinner, but I'm still a little hungry right now. Hungary, became separate nations. That's number 2. And new nations were formed with new borders. Finland, Estonia, Estonia. Finland is Finland, like you didn't know that. Latvia, Latvia. Lithuania, Lithuania. Poland, which existed in the past but had fallen to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Czechoslovakia, where some of my people came from. Czechoslovakia, Czechoslovakia, Czechoslovakia. So, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Czechoslovakia all became new nations. And then there were several nations that were enlarged. Romania, Romania, Belgium, Belgium, Italy, Geppetto knows how to spell that. You can ask him if you need to. Greece, Greece, and Yugoslavia, where some of my other people came from. Yugoslavia, Yugoslavia. And amazingly enough, public sentiment against getting into European affairs, a lot of Americans didn't want to fight in the war and knew that we lost a lot of soldiers. America did not join the League of Nations. Now, next time, we are going to talk about the rise of communism in Russia. Don't forget to study for your quizzes. You guys have had quiz reviews pretty much every day, or a test. Work hard, guys. Make me proud. Make your parents proud. You have a great opportunity to learn. Take advantage of it. I miss you guys. I hope you're having a good day. And tomorrow, we will talk about the rise of communism in Russia.